Hello, everyone, and welcome back to those of you who are joining us from the previous session. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the ITF Transport Outlook 2021. In this session, we are going to discuss the results for urban mobility more closely, and I am joined by my colleagues Mallory Trouvé and Joshua Patanina Blanco to present the results of this chapter. We will then be joined for more in-depth discussion by our guest speaker, Lina Marcela Quiñones, the Director of Intelligence for Mobility at the Mobility Secretariat of Bogota. Throughout this session, I invite you to please use the Q&A box on your screen to submit questions. And please do take a moment to respond to our quick poll, which will inform some discussion later. And the poll, which you should be able to see also on the right-hand side of your screen, will remain open during the presentation. There is also a discussion box for you to chat with other participants, although I would bring to your attention that the discussion box is not monitored by ITF staff. So if there is a point you wish to raise with us for discussion, please do use that Q&A function. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties, please use the red live support button in the top right-hand corner of your screen to raise assistance from the technical staff. And with that, I will now invite Mallory and Joshua to please present the findings for urban mobility. And I think, Mallory, you're to speak first, please.
Thank you, Ola. Sorry for this little delay. So thank you for giving me the floor. I'm Mallory Trouvé. I will present the results for the urban passenger transport sector of the ITF Transport Outlook 2021 with my colleague Joshua Patanina Blanco. We want to highlight that Maliti Fernando is also an author of this analysis. And this session will focus on showing how cities can make mobility sustainable, equitable, and resilient. So first, a quick reminder of what Maliti presented a few minutes ago. So the ITF Transport Outlook 2021 aims at providing estimations of transport demand, CO2 emissions, and other indicators such as resilience or accessibility between 2015 and 2050. In order to do so, we built 3 scenarios. So the first policy scenario is a recover scenario, which is the current trajectory. Basically, if we keep doing the policies that we are doing today, and if we stay on track. The second policy scenario is a reshape scenario. This scenario is a paradigm shift from the recover scenario. Basically, all of the policy measures implemented in recover are implemented at a higher level. So for instance, higher congestion charge, quicker vehicle electrification, stronger incentives for active and micromobility. And last, the reshape plus scenario is a reinforced reshape building on a better answer to the COVID-19 pandemic. So while the Transport Outlook encompasses all of the transport sectors, this session is about urban passenger transport. So the daily mobility of people in a city setting. This analysis encompasses all of the urban area over the world. So I'll start by presenting the key a strong pressure on demand, which would almost triple by 2050. So urban travel demand is under a strong pressure. When we look at the effect of urban passenger transport emissions, if we stay on the current trajectory, the emissions wouldn't diminish much. They would just remain the same. This is not what we want if we want to reach the climate goals. While if we adopt a more ambitious policy setting, and if we have a better recovery from COVID-19, we could aim at reducing the emissions in 2050 by 80%. So there would be just a fifth of what would happen under the current trajectory. So we must adopt more ambitious policies to reduce to reduce CO2 emissions. When we go into detail at which mode is responsible for these emissions, Well, clearly, private vehicles are responsible for 75% of urban passenger transport CO2 emissions, while they only represent 51% of the demand. So we can say that private vehicles are the highest emitting mode. They're also relatively space intensive, especially when there is just one passenger per car. They are not available to everyone because it's expensive to purchase or even to maintain such vehicles. The paradox is that most of the transport systems are built for these modes, and a high share of the urban area is dedicated to their use. The point here is not to say that these private vehicles are bad things. They are actually very interesting solutions and they are useful, but the way we use them today is not efficient enough to reach climate goals. And the last finding is about resilience. So resilience is a difficult topic to address because there are many definitions of resilience. In this analysis, we consider resilience as modal diversity. Basically, the principle is that if there is a high modal diversity, then the system would better perform when one mode is disrupted. So here, when we look at the results, in 2015 and in 2050, under the current trajectory, the equilibrium roughly stays the same. There's just the apparition of shared mobility, but the modes are equivalent to what they were in 2015. While if we have a more ambitious approach, and if we leverage on the recovery from COVID-19, then we could really increase the share of shared mobility modes and of active and micro-mobility, which would increase the resilience. So increasing the variety of sustainable modes can increase resiliency at the same time. So now my colleague Joshua will present the main takeaways which are drawn from these findings.
Thank you very much, Mallory. Now, to present the four main takeaways of our study. The first one is that two main strategies can help manage demand and are needed to manage demand and deliver sustainable transport services across the world. One main strategy for developing regions and another one for developed ones. If you look at the graph at the left of the presentation, you can see the evolution of per capita demand in OECD and non-OECD countries. OECD countries in dark blue and non-OECD ones in light blue. What we see is that by 2050, per capita demand in OECD countries is going to increase slightly. But then in non-OECD ones, it's going to do so massively. As a result of this situation, per capita emissions, CO2 emissions in non-OECD countries are going to stay roughly the same by 2050 as they were in 2015. And in non-OECD countries, in OECD countries, per capita emissions are not going to decrease as much as they should if we want to meet wider environmental sustainability objectives. To meet this very unsustainable situation in developing world regions, it's essential that we leapfrog unsustainable patterns of demand growth. This means that we move away from having high levels of long-distance mobility by unsustainable modes, and that we focus rather on providing sustainable alternatives so that we can create a more innovative and sustainable future. In developed regions, rather, the logic should be to insist on optimizing very high levels of demand, for instance, by increasing occupancy rates of vehicles. Now, a second takeaway of our work is that there is a common policy principle that can help to achieve both of these strategies for developing and developed regions alike. And this is to focus on increasing access to nearby opportunities, for instance, by integrating transport policy and land use planning. Now, the idea here is to create cities that are neighborhood-centric. Imagine just cities where it would be possible to access essential opportunities, such as schools, shops, work opportunities, or hospitals, very close to where we live, and where mobility systems are designed to answer to this reality. If we comply with these criteria, it will be possible to shorten distances, and the distances that we will need to cover, we can do them by walking, by cycling, or by using public transport in a way that's cost-effective for authorities. Now, and this is very important, if policies are implementing while thinking about equity and the social sustainability of systems, it will be possible to really increase access for all population groups. This means for people who do not have a private vehicle, but also for people who have a particular impairment or who are otherwise disadvantaged in the current mobility system. Now, let's just try to look at what would be some of the main impacts of such an approach. As you see in the graph at the left, if we follow an ambitious approach and we aim at increasing access to opportunities, by 2050, per capita demand will still increase, but much less than if we hadn't increased ambition. But what's more important is that by 2050, because this demand in such an ambitious scenario can be met by sustainable mode, then the decarbonization potential is massive. What I mean by this is that if we use the COVID-19 pandemic recovery, for instance, for making sure that in cities around the world it's possible to cycle more, then it will be possible to double the mitigation impact, the per capita mitigation impact, as we see in the graph in the right. Now, there is a main idea behind all of these principles, and this is our third main takeaway, that for decarbonizing cities, it's important to reduce reliance on private vehicles. This can only be done if we increase ambition by aiming at reflecting the real cost of using a car or a private vehicle for society, but also by improving vehicle technology so that we can have cleaner transport fleets. If ambition doesn't change, by 2050, private vehicles are going to fulfill 40% of demand and emit half of urban passenger transport emissions. But then with more ambition, and if we leverage on the COVID-19 pandemic recovery, then private vehicles will fulfill only around 1/3 of all demand and emit less than 1/3 of all emissions. Now, the idea here should be to provide real alternative and think about the social sustainability of systems. This means that in areas where private vehicles are currently the only way of traveling, it's important to provide alternatives so that people still have ways of traveling, especially in lower income areas. Our four main takeaway follows suit. If we want to provide real alternatives, we need to promote multimodal urban transport systems that have public transport at their backbone. And for this, integration with forms of shared mobility is going to be crucial. This is because such integration can offer last mile connectivity in areas where previously public transport couldn't reach because of low levels of demand. But then it also makes the use of transport vehicles more efficient. Imagine just how more sustainable it would be to have 3 or 4 people in inside one car as opposed to only one. If authorities do this by also increasing the reliability, the frequency, the cleanness and the safety of public transport services, particularly for women when it comes to safety, it will be very possible to attract new users, and this is the key for a more sustainable future. Now, just to wrap up, we have 4 main key findings and takeaways. Urbanization will increase demand for sustainable transport around the world in the future, and 2 main strategies are going to be needed. One in developing regions to leapfrog unsustainable demand growth patterns, and one for developed regions to optimize very high levels of existing demand so that we can meet this sustainable future. There is a high potential for decarbonization. By 2050, it would be possible to cut around 80% of urban mobility's carbon footprint. But this can only be done if we really focus on increasing access to nearby opportunities, for instance, by integrating transport policy and land use planning. Now, we know that private vehicles emit 3/4 of CO2 emissions from urban passenger transport nowadays. So it's essential that we reduce reliance on private vehicles for decarbonizing cities. If we do this, we can increase the sustainability of systems, and this could mean in the future greater resilience. This will be necessary only by providing multimodal transport systems that have public transport at the backbone of them. These principles are going to be the key for a more sustainable urban passenger transport future. Thank you very much for your attention, and I give back the floor to Orla.
Thank you both very much for that presentation of the more detailed results for urban mobility. And I can see that many of our participants have responded to the poll already, so I'm looking forward to discussing those very interesting results shortly. But first, I would very much like to invite Lina Marcela Quiñones of the Mobility Secretariat of Bogota to please join us and offer her insights on urban mobility, which we look forward to hearing. Lina, you are very welcome, and thank you very much for making the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Orla, and thank you, Mallory and Joshua, for that very interesting presentation. These results come in a very interesting time for Bogota, as we are actually launching our new, or like the process for a new urban development plan, which is called Plan for Territory Organization, Plan de Ordenamiento Territorial in Spanish. And so I am very happy to see that a lot of what is there and a lot of what we are working on at the Secretaría is actually very much in line with what Mallory and Joshua just presented. I want to highlight this very important figure of 80% reduction in CO2 emissions if we are actually more ambitious in our transport policies, in our urban transport policies. So it's a huge impact that we can have if we develop the right policies. For Bogota, we are actually having very ambitious goals. When we worked with Joshua and the team on this tool, we actually realized that we were being very, very ambitious already. We are aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050, which is a big goal, especially when you consider, and again, I'm talking about what Joshua mentioned, and is how in developing countries, or in such as Colombia, and especially in Bogota, the demand for passenger transport is increasing rapidly, and also motorization rates. In Bogota, we do have let's say favorable mode share, as in only 15% of trips are done by private car, which is very good. And actually our main mode of transport is on foot, with 24% of trips made on foot daily. But our main challenge is to keep that share the way it is, because we have seen how the share of private vehicles or trips on private vehicles has been increasing throughout the years, and how people are using public transport or traveling by foot, not because they choose to, but because they do not have access to other modes they may consider better. So we do have a challenge of making public transport attractive and comfortable, and as Joshua said, clean and safe. Especially after the pandemic, we have seen our ridership drop completely. A lot of people are migrating to bicycle use. Around 23% of the people that are using our temporary or semi-permanent bike lanes, our COVID bike lanes, were public transport users. So it's good that they are shifting to this mode, which is completely, it has no direct emissions, but it's also worrying that we are losing so many people that used to ride on public transit. So it's a big challenge there. Aside from that, we are also working on, going back to our land use planning. We are working on a 30-minute city, having more services accessible by walking and biking. And this is going to, there's a big push for this on our new land use plan. And then we are also working on making vehicle use more efficient, this private car use more efficient. We have a program called Pico y Placa Solidario, And so Bogota has had now for many years this scheme in which, according to the last number of your plate, you can or cannot take out your car on certain days. It works very well on the short term, but then we realized that people were just buying 2 cars so they can switch. And so we have been working on, maybe instead of just buying a second car, you can pay for a permit, and this will allow you to drive your car on the days that you're not supposed to. But at least, this is kind of internalizing the externalities that Joshua mentioned. And now we have added, since last year, another exception, and is if you are actually driving with at least 3 people in your car, I mean 3 people including the driver, then you can also take out your car on the days you have this restriction. So there has been a lot of acceptance of this measure. We have been quite successful in this. And it's very nice to see how people are willing to share, and actually that we can make this private vehicle use more efficient. And then I also want to get back on the COVID recovery and how can we actually harness what we learned or what has been happening to improve the way or rethink the way that we move around in the city. And we realize, of course, that a lot of activities can be carried out from home. Many people in Bogota, especially those who have more corporate jobs that are higher income people, they can actually work from home. They have realized that companies have realized that they can adapt quite quickly to people working from home. And then this is something that we actually expect to continue happening at maybe not on the same degree, but at some degree in the future after, well, hopefully after the pandemic is over. And this is actually interesting because then again, these are the people who mostly use private cars. So we might see some reduction on this also by people who are just not traveling every day to their jobs, just working from home. So overall, I think this outlook that ITF prepared is fantastic and is a very important input for everything that we are doing in Bogota. We have worked closely with the team, and ITF provided us with a tool that allows us to model different scenarios and actually connect this transport modeling with emissions, which is not something, I mean, we have our models and then we have our emission standards and how we calculate that, but connecting the two is very important for us so we can actually see what the impact of the policies we are planning will, what this impact will be. So thank you, Mallory, and thank you, Joshua, and everyone at ITF for developing this and for providing us with all this input. I'm very happy to see that a lot of what you mentioned is what we are doing in Bogota. So yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to comment on this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lena. It's fantastic to get feedback from a policymaker who is going through the sustainable planning process and has experience of implementing such a range of different policy measures that we would consider. We are also delighted to hear that the measures that we're mentioning align with what is being done there, and also that the tool is being used. So thank you very much for sharing those insights with us there. So I'm going now to turn, Lena, if we could stick with you maybe, and I'm just going to take a look at the poll results. So I think we can close the poll now. And if we share the results, so we have asked those in the audience, which decarbonisation measures do they think will be easiest for authorities to combine with the wider social and equity objectives after the pandemic? So there was a mixture of sort of mode share, longer term planning, and also changes to drivers of demand, which is the teleworking as mentioned there. And interestingly, our our audience feel that the mode shift, so the promotion of either active mobility or public transport, and this is similar to results this morning, but a slightly larger share of respondents voted for mode shift to active mobility and public transport through promotion of those modes. Lena, in terms of the ease from your perspective of integrating these different measures into a decarbonisation plan that also respects social objectives, what do you think of these results?
So when it comes to transport sustainability, it's also a matter of equity and social equity, you know. As Joshua mentioned, or maybe Mallory, when we consider car use, it's the most polluting, it's the one that takes up most space, and it's also the one that is not affordable. And actually, for example, in Bogota, mostly the victims of road crashes, which are caused a lot by cars, are people who live in the periphery of the city, people who have lower incomes. So, and of course, are mostly pedestrians and motorcycle users, again, people who are, you know, lower income. So I think, you know, it's integrating sustainability with social equity it's very much, they're both very much in line. I do think it's not easy to implement actually on the ground a lot of these measures that we know we have to implement, that maybe Joshua mentioned in the end. It's a bit difficult for example, sometimes political reasons, sometimes bureaucratic reasons. You know, we have to go through a lot of steps. So there's where we have some difficulties. But, you know, as you guys mentioned, we just have to be more ambitious and believe in this and actually work on and implementing these measures.
Thank you very much. Mallory, would you like to comment on that from the perspective of the outlook and the work that you've been?
Sustainability. And so it's very important for us because when we design the models which were used to produce these results, it was a big question, how to represent social impacts in models. Usually quantitative models are not very adapted for this. The data is rarely available to make this analysis. And so we try to use these models as much as we can to produce these results. And I think this outlook is a first step toward integrating more social indicators in our models.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mallory. So if anyone in the audience has more specific questions that they would like the participants to consider, please feel free to use the Q&A function in order to submit them. So we do have one question that has come through. Lena, if you would be okay with staying with us for a couple of minutes, it is directed to you specifically. So in Bogota, what is your plan for the electrification of buses, please?
That's a great question, thank you. So Bogota has a bus-based public transport system. We do not have yet, we are working on building a metro system that our mass transit is based on BRT, bus rapid transit. So actually, you know, we have a lot of potential to be game changers when it comes to bus electrification. And we have been working a lot on improving our public transport fleet. Transmilenio, which is the public-private company that manages public transport in Bogota, has actually acquired 1,485 electric buses to operate in the city. They are kind of regular buses, not the articulated buses that we use on the BRT system, but just the ones that are all over the city. And that actually has made us the city with the most electric buses outside of China. And we are very proud of that. And it's fantastic because we are actually, these buses are operating right now on the western part of the city, which is the one that has the most air quality problems. Particulate matter tends to concentrate there. And so it's very nice that these cleaner buses are actually replacing older polluting buses in these areas, which are the ones that most need it. And then we are also working on exploring other options for these articulated and bi-articulated buses that we need to operate on the BRT system. There are some pilots, some tests with a bi-articulated electric bus that I believe is the only one in the world, and it's in Bogota running tests. So we are working a lot on that. And not only public transport, we are also developing our electric mobility public policy, which I say it's with capital P, public policy, because it's just a document that has to follow a lot of rules and procedure that has been defined. And we are working also, we have a goal to encourage electrification of the taxi fleet, for example, which is also, a fleet that is very intensive in use and it's somewhat old. And so we have taxis that are even, older than 20 years running around Bogota. So we are also working on that. And it's quite new. Bogota has had a push for bicycles for like 40 years since we started Ciclovia, but this electrification is quite new, but we are moving ahead quite quickly, and proud and happy of that.
Great, thank you very much for that, Lina. And Mallory or Joshua, possibly Joshua, this is one for you. We've looked at public transport as a backbone of sustainable urban mobility. Do you have anything further to add in terms of the broader electrification or sustainable policies based on changes to public transport?
Sorry, just as a clarification, this is regarding the vehicle technologies, or also having a mode shift and having people use public transport more?
Starting with vehicle technologies, but also broadening out. There's no point in having empty, clean buses running around. So I suppose it's more sort of starting with the vehicle technologies, but then also moving towards the user-centered policies.
Of course. There are a few points in this. If we look at the efforts of Bogota, of course, they are remarkable. And it's a remarkable example, not only because it's very ambitious, but because it's a high level of ambition that we see in a city in a developing region. Now, if we look at cities in other parts of the world, many of them might have the difficulty to reach this level of ambition when it comes to decarbonization. Why is this? This is first because the potential of electrification for decarbonization depends on the energy matrix of the particular location. It's good to promote public transport, but if we think about electrified public transport in a place where the energy mix is not necessarily very sustainable, then electrification shouldn't necessarily be the first idea that should come to mind. Rather, public transport promotion in itself could be this key, be it, of course, by renewing fleets for more cleaner vehicles that are not necessarily electric, but also by insisting on public transport infrastructure. Now, there is something that is essential also from our results. When it comes to having public transport as the backbone of the mobility system, we see it as a way for public transport to serve as the coordinator of a mobility system that's really multimodal. And what do I mean by this? I mean that maybe some trips that were previously done by public transport now can be done by more sustainable modes. Instead of using public transport, you could even walk or cycle somewhere. So public transport in this case is relegated to the place where it needs to be used for middle to long distances. But this can only be achieved if Everything else is articulated around public transport. So it's essential that we aim at having this system as the backbone of multimodal sustainable transport system for having proper behavioral change.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you both. I realize I broadened the scope of that question a little bit, but thank you, Lena, for the very specific example and response, and Joshua for the broader response. And Joshua, you mentioned about other regions in the world, and we had a question earlier, which I think is very interesting in terms of the drive towards public transport as a backbone. Is there anything further you can say on the formalization of informal transport that we have at the moment, please? Mallory, you're nodding. I can ask you to follow up if there's anything further that you have to add. Thank you. Joshua.
Of course. In our study, we saw that paratransit services, informal transport services, depending on the term that you decide to use, are essential when it comes to understanding emissions in developing regions. In many developing regions, such as Latin America and the Caribbean or Sub-Saharan Africa, because a lot of transport demand is answered by informal transport, but then the fleets are very old, then paratransit can be a source of emissions. So if we formalize these services, but we keep old fleets, let's say that the potential for decarbonization is not necessarily as high as it could be. Formalization could, of course, come for push for renewing fleets. Then it's especially essential that we focus in integrating these newly formalized services into public transport services. If we don't have this integration with public transport, then newly formalized services could come as a competition for public transport. And this, on the opposite, could just create more problems for cities. So it's important that when we think about formalization, we think about real integration. Now, we didn't necessarily look at the political economy of how these changes would happen. This is something that each city needs to explore on its own, but it's definitely something that needs to be thought of. So thank you so much for that question.
Thank you, Joshua. And with your political economy answer, you got there ahead of me. So thank you very much for adding that in as well. Now, Mallory, I had hoped there were also questions about the model, but I'm conscious that we are going to run out of time very quickly. So maybe you could just give us a quick indication of how the CO2 emissions per capita evolve for urban mobility by the different regions.
Well, basically, there is, as Joshua has presented earlier, we have two main directions. We have the developed countries, which already have high levels of CO2 emissions per capita, and the emerging regions who have low emissions per capita. The idea is to optimize and to reduce the emissions per capita from the most developed regions, and for the emerging economies to avoid reaching the levels of developed economies. The idea behind this is that anyway, emission in emerging economies will face the strong challenge of the huge pressure on demand, which is coming from the demographic and economic growth at the same time. But they should make efforts to avoid translating this into a strong increase in CO2 emissions per capita.
Excellent. Thank you very much. There were so many more questions that I had on my list to ask, but unfortunately we have run out of time. I would like to say thank you very much to Lina Marcela Quiñones for joining us today and for sharing such valuable insights and specific examples of these actions. So moving from advice to action, and Lina is the great example, or presented great examples rather, of that this afternoon. So for those of you looking for more information from the Outlook, you can download the Outlook and summaries from the ITF Outlook webpage, and the results are also available from the OECD statistics page. If you would like to visit the ITF stand in the exhibition hall on the virtual platform, you can also get the executive summaries in several different languages. I will encourage you, please, to stick with us to return to your timeline and join the non-urban passenger session, which will be starting in 4 minutes. So I really must leave, but thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you again to our guest speaker and to my colleagues, and I wish you all a very happy afternoon.